I'm Dr. James Bylund. I am a licensed clinical and educational psychologist, and I am the owner and director of the Bylund Clinic.
Hi, my name is Danielle Morales. I'm a licensed educational psychologist and the co-director of the Bylund Clinic.
So, Danielle, today we're going to talk about how parents can prepare for difficult IEP meetings. IEPs can be physically and emotionally exhausting. In all honesty, as a parent who doesn't have a background in this area, it's hard for me to imagine what it's even like to walk into a meeting where it's you and you know 8 or 10 school district personnel, handing you stacks of paper that are written in what seems like a foreign language, and then we're asked to make educated decisions about our child's education, on the spot. So, as a parent, I know we've got a lot of hopes and expectations when we go into the meeting. Obviously, we want what's best for our child, but those meetings can quickly start to feel really overwhelming and confusing, and sometimes even emotionally triggering. So, today, want to talk about what parents can do perhaps in advance of those meetings to prepare, emotionally and practically.
Yeah, I appreciate this discussion. I think it's such a good question and such a good topic. I think the other piece that's important for framing is the parent's perspective versus the school's perspective in these contexts, right? So, as a parent, even one meeting might represent the culmination of years of anxiety and assessments you've had done previously, and all the struggle that you're seeing behind the scenes at home. So, you may be pinning really high expectations and hopes on the outcome of a meeting where the district, while hopefully they're being sensitive to that and empathetic and just generally good humans in that context, that may be the fifth IEP meeting they've had that week or the third one they've had that day. And so there can be a little bit of a mismatch, right, between kind of the emotional weight and the emotional baggage of what it means to be a parent in that seat versus what it means to be the district in that seat.
Yeah, for sure.
Mhm. So, one of the first pieces of advice I typically give parents is actually just accepting outright that it's going to be a difficult meeting. So, sometimes what I'll hear from parents is, well, I really hope that, this one is going to go smoother, this one is going to go better, especially coming off the heels of something like an IEE, an independent educational evaluation, for example, that you feel like more holistically and better captures your kids' needs, that's going to lead to kind of this aha moment between the parent and the district, or just kind of smooth out some of those areas of communication that previously have been sticking points. And while that does certainly happen, and it's great if that is the outcome, it is still a fact that a lot of IEP meetings are going to be difficult just because of the factors
Mm.
that we talked about already. And so, actually accepting that it is going to be difficult can help reduce your anxiety, which seems a little bit counterintuitive, but when you basically drop the resistance and try to, or try to make yourself accept that it's going to be uncomfortable, you can
Mhm.
actually start to feel more comfortable, and not add layers of frustration or denial or feeling underprepared for how triggering some things can be in the moment. The other component that I would say is important is noting that yes, that one meeting is important, but it's just one step. So avoiding black and white thinking. So teams can come back to the table again and again. You can discuss things more than once. Not feeling pressured that everything get decided or everything get ironed out in that 60 minutes. What
Yeah.
about you, James? What are some things that you've told parents to emotionally prepare?
Yeah, just real quick, I think you bring up a really important point, right? So, as a parent, you know, we're sitting at that table with nothing but our child's best interest in mind, right? Like we're 100% focused on our children and their needs, and we're there to advocate for for their needs. And while I have to imagine, right, that everybody that's working in schools and working in and around special education got into this to help kids. But uh, they're not sitting in that seat in the position as a parent, right? There's some become perhaps a little bit jaded to the process. Some of them may feel like they sort of have their hands tied in the process. They're assessing and working with dozens of kids. Frankly, their investment in your child is different than it is for you as a parent. And because of that, I think the emotions are naturally more elevated. As a parent, we've got a stake in this game, right? Like we have a lot on the line. This is our child's education and our child's future. And I think the way you framed it, just sort of understandably, it's just emotionally a different experience for a parent than it is for everybody else. And I like that approach of really sort of accepting the fact that this can be a challenging experience. Along the same lines as what you just said, I do think it's really important for parents to understand that they don't need to agree to anything at the meeting. So one of the things that it blows my mind, right, that a parent goes into an IEP meeting, assuming that they're not a special education director, as or a school psychologist or a neuropsychologist or a dyslexia specialist or whatever it is, right? Assuming that that's not their background. All of this paperwork is lengthy, is written in legalese. There are foreign terms that are used regularly by people in the IEP team meeting that, in fact, they'll just speak in acronyms, throughout the meeting, and not realizing that doesn't make any sense whatsoever to parents. But they hand the stack of IEP paperwork on top of stacks of reports that are equally written in a foreign language. You may have never even seen the report before, right? Or had a chance to read through it. And maybe that's something we can talk about too, about just, getting all that paperwork ahead of time. Then they turn to you 60 minutes later and ask you to make life-changing decisions about your child's education. I mean, I don't think any parent should agree to anything at the outcome of that meeting. That they really should take time to process what's been shared, to have enough time to thoroughly read through the paperwork, to ask questions, to make suggestions, but don't feel pressured that at the end of that meeting you have to agree to anything. It seems impossible for somebody to sit through one of those meetings and take in all that information in 60 minutes and be able to make a snap decision.
I agree. And I think that there can be two pitfalls. I think sometimes, a parent may sit through that 60-minute meeting and they may feel so relieved, for example, that finally the district is saying, yes, your child is eligible for
Yeah.
services. And so they feel this overwhelming, sense of urgency and relief to
To
get
get,
that
yeah, to get
signed,
the
to
help in
get it,
place. Yeah.
in
Good
place
point.
as soon as possible. But even though you have that gratitude and that moment of relief, it's still important to take the paperwork back and read it carefully,
Yeah.
with another set of eyes. Because even if again, they're entering special education, they're finally going to get some services. You're happy because it has things like reading goals, for example. There may be still some holes, right? So you may give it a second read when emotions are a little more calm, and it's like, oh, okay, yeah, there is a reading comprehension goal, but wait, we did talk about decoding in the meeting. I want to make sure there's a decoding goal. Or now that I give a second look at these services, I'm so happy they're qualifying, but they seem a little bit low on second read. And so giving yourself a chance for the emotions to settle and read
Yeah.
things through with a more calm and removed mindset is really helpful. And in the other bucket, right, if you're sitting through this meeting, you have all these hopes and expectations, they get dashed. You feel again like the district is not seeing what you're seeing at home, or you feel gaslit, or you feel like there's huge holes in the assessment. And the district is presenting things as very final, right? Your child doesn't qualify. Checking the box here acknowledges that you recognize they don't qualify. One of the things I often talk with parents about after the fact is you have all these options for responding to that, right? So
Right.
you can take the paperwork back and do something like consent with exceptions, or,
Right.
write a prior written notice, a letter that accompanies why you don't agree with the decision for ineligibility, or request an IEE, right, on the heels of that. And so, by just checking a box, either yes or no, you can kind of pigeonhole yourself into a situation that may be more difficult to get out of a little later down the line.
Yeah.
And I know I hear from a lot of parents situations where, the district will then come back and say, well, if you didn't agree, why did you sign? And so just taking a moment to make sure that the dust has settled, either, to kind of see through the emotions of elation, or, the opposite of really feeling like you don't have any options and so frustrated, can be really important.
Yeah, no, and I like that you brought up the idea that you can consent with exceptions. So again, my perspective is okay, take it all in, good or bad, go home, read through it, make sure you understand everything that's in there. Ask questions if you don't, right? But then you can agree to the things you agree with, and disagree to others. And what that means is those things that you disagree with still get ironed out, right? So either there's changes to the IEP that they send you to review, or you meet again to discuss some of those areas. But that's an important point, right? That you can agree like, yes, they're eligible. I agree. Thank you. Thank God they're going to start getting these services. But maybe we don't quite agree on all the goals or how the goals are written, and maybe we don't have firm agreement on terms of like the extent of the services that are going to be needed for that child. So yeah, that's a really good point, right? And yeah, and I think, like you've said, sort of knowing these things up front to kind of sort of mentally prepare us, and can take some of the emotion, out of it. Like we don't feel this pressure that we need to sort of make this decision when we don't fully understand what's actually being proposed yet. That there's no rush.
Sure. Or you might agree that they don't qualify for an IEP, but they may need a 504 or mental health
Yeah.
services, right? And so there's so many other layers and different avenues that we can address kids' needs. So it's just important to take a step back and remove yourself, and
Yeah.
also to get a second opinion. So read it over with your partner, read it over with an advocate, read it over with a family member that's a special education teacher, right?
Yeah.
You really want to make sure that everything is making sense before you sign and agree to move forward. Because, like you said, some of these decisions can be life changing. And so there is a lot of weight that's put into, whether you consent or not. So don't feel rushed in that process either way.
Yeah, no, I like that. So there's the sort of emotional component of these assessments, right? And how do we prepare for the emotion of it? But how do we sort of practically prepare for it? Like IEP paperwork and so forth.
Yeah. So one of the things that you said earlier, I think is really important, where there can be a tendency for districts to present the IEP and all the reports in one go in one day. So you may get the psychoeducational report, the academic report, the speech report, and the initial drafted IEP all in one meeting. I don't think I can listen to somebody speak for that long and that many professionals speak for that long. And so again, I can't imagine not having a background in psychology and trying to sit through the meetings through that lens. So all this to be said, if you know your child is getting multiple assessments, request the assessments in advance. So reach out to the school psychologist and say, hey, can I get a copy of the report a couple days beforehand? School psychologists and the school team, they're very busy. They may not be able to get it, to you a week before, but even having a day or two just to glance it over so you can look at some of the big picture takeaways is going to be really important. And if you are able to get that report in advance, taking time to highlight it, start marking it up with questions, and come prepared, because you're going to hear a summarized version of the report in the meeting. And some of the pieces that you may have particular questions about or really want to drill down on may not even be covered in that summary. And so you may not get the chance to organically ask follow-up questions in that area. So always requesting the reports in advance. If that's not able to be provided to you, that again harkens back to how important it is to be present in the meeting to the greatest degree possible and prepare to then make some of those big decisions outside of the meeting. The
Yeah.
other thing that I would recommend doing, is drafting responses in advance to questions that might be triggering. So, for example, I know that some clients have had, particularly tense relationships with maybe a certain person on site, whether that be the principal or the school counselor or the gen ed teacher, that may say comments that may be particularly or feel particularly dismissive, or they may make kind of the same theme of comments that they feel are a really inaccurate framing of their child and just bring up a lot of emotion in the moment. So if you know that some of those questions or comments are likely going to come up, I actually recommend sitting down a couple days beforehand and writing out what you're going to say in response. And so that way in the moment, if somebody makes a comment such as, well, their writing isn't that bad, you're not then feeling like you need to stop everything, kind of mentally unpack all the layers, come up with a defensive response and, evidence in the moment. You already have kind of a canned and calm thing you can say. And if those comments don't come up, and hopefully they don't, it's still very therapeutic to sit down and kind of write and process what you would say in those moments so that you can again step in feeling a little more prepared.
Yeah, no, I really like that. I really like that idea, right? I mean, certainly, um, it's very common. Just I want parents to understand, like, to request the paperwork ahead of time. I would say if you go back 10 years ago, districts would be like, well, they sort of say it's not really ready yet until we get to the IEP meeting. But districts have gotten so accustomed to that request now that I think most districts will honor to try to get that report to you, 5 days in advance. Now, there may be some circumstances where that's not possible, right? It's certainly a very common request, right? So I wouldn't hesitate, as a parent to ask that. And I really like that suggestion about having some sort of prepared, responses to things. And, along those same lines too, in terms of being prepared, as parents, we know our kids, frankly, better than everybody else. That's just flat out true, right? That, like, how could anybody else know your child better than you? I mean, I'm a parent, and I don't think anybody knows my kids as well as I do. Their strengths and their challenges, right? I know them inside and out. I think now too, when information is so readily available online, I think as parents we can gather a lot of information. We oftentimes parents end up becoming more of an expert on their child's area of need than any member of that IEP team, right? So, if they're having difficulty with writing, having writing samples, available at sort of, exemplars of what your concerns are. And I think, going online to something like, was it understood.org, or, some of these websites where parents can easily access, information about various, learning and developmental conditions, and having that information ready to go to be able to share as well too, particularly when you're talking about, goals and services and whatnot. So yeah, I mean, I think, doing some of that footwork ahead of time, and being prepared to talk about, your child's specific needs and what, uh, would be helpful for them. Doing all that work ahead of time will certainly make that IP meeting a lot easier.
I agree. And I love the idea of bringing work samples from home too, because especially when you have a child that's struggling with learning, you might be the one sitting with them and doing their writing homework, doing their math homework.
Yeah.
And so taking pictures of that, creating a binder of that. If you do have emails, for example, you've gotten about your child's academic or emotional struggles over the years, printing those out, it does take a lot of work. It takes a lot of cognitive effort to kind of organize all this information and get it together. But again, there is a therapeutic aspect of putting something concrete together that represents your lived experience and your child's struggles. And then if things do feel dismissed in the meeting, oh, look, actually, I have their essay from last night. Look at all the erase marks, look at all the grammar and punctuation issues, you have that evidence ready to go. And it can also, again, reduce the emotional back and forth of just having more of like a give and take argument or disagreement in the moment. You're bringing out work samples to have a more informed discussion.
Yeah, and, school districts can administer, so two things, on that topic too, right? So with the work samples is one, the school district's gonna administer some tests. Um, as a parent, we don't actually know what those tests, how they're actually administered and measured, right? It may very well be it's a very common test that's given by schools, that assesses writing, that produces very inflated scores because they don't actually require the child to do much writing. It's a fill in the blank test. They might have to write a sentence or so. But if your child is in upper elementary, middle, or high school, by no means does it accurately assess their writing. So having those work samples to bring in, and to be able to share visually, with the team what their writing actually looks like and how that might not, align with what the test score says their writing skills are, I think can be really helpful. And also along those lines too, a lot of times schools will say, well, they're doing just fine. I don't see any issues whatsoever. Their work that's coming home looks great. And they have no idea the amount of help that child is getting at home in order to be able to produce that work. Right. So oftentimes that work isn't work that child's doing independently. It's either, the parent is sitting with them painstakingly for hours to try to um, develop their work to a stage at which it's ready to turn in. Or maybe they're working with outside professionals that are helping them to be able to do that work. So having those work samples to show what they're able to do independently, it can serve again serve multiple purposes and really be helpful, not just for you as a parent, but also for the whole IEP team to really understand what's actually going on. And just sort of one other thing kind of came up around like the emotional piece, because it can be really overwhelming. You can invite whoever you want to the meeting with you. So the school district will say they have certain required members. They have to have an administrator. They have to have a general ed teacher. They have to have a special education teacher. They have to have somebody who can interpret any tests that were administered, right? So usually that's the person who administered the test. And they may bring in other people too. And if your child's in middle school or high school, there might be multiple teachers there. But a parent can also invite anyone they want. So maybe it's just a close family friend that's there for emotional support. Maybe that close family friend has also worked with your child and they can provide some input around what the child's needs are. That could also be, an educational advocate or somebody that you bring to that meeting too. That's there both for emotional support and sort of technical expertise. So again, as a parent, you can they'll tell you who's coming and they'll invite you. It probably says on the form that you can invite somebody, but it might not always be really clear that you can invite whoever you want to that meeting.
Mhm. And I think that's a great point with whether it be family or an educational advocate, is for some people, again, this context can be so overwhelming that it's hard to communicate what you want to communicate. And you may be a little bit hesitant to speak up in the meeting because you might start choking up or, crying, or, you're going to raise your voice or your voice might tremble and shake. And so you might want somebody else to kind of be the main communicator for you, whether that be, again, a family member, a friend, or an advocate. Whichever route you go, right, there's benefits of tapping in somebody more informally, or somebody who has more trained expertise in these areas. But bringing an advocate in particular, if you're anticipating a pretty emotionally burdensome or triggering meeting, can be really important because their job is to keep their head on what are the regulations, what are the rules, and they can also ask very pointed follow-up questions that as parents we may not think of in the moment, and be able to kind of push back on things from a lens that really helps propel the conversation forward, as opposed to getting stuck in kind of, again, that more back and forth exchange, that's a little bit more emotionally charged.
Yeah. Now, I mentioned earlier, right? Like parents are the experts in their child, right? You might not be an expert in special education regulations. You might not be an expert in psychoeducational evaluations, but you're absolutely an expert in your child. And I also tell parents too, they're honestly the most powerful person at the IPT meeting, because nothing can be implemented without their consent, right? So they actually have more power in the decision making than anybody else at the meeting. One thing also to add to that is. It's supposed to be a team decision. Okay. And there's actually regulations that state that the decisions cannot be quote unquote predetermined, right? The school district team cannot come in having already made the decision around eligibility or goals or services. It is the law is intended for it to be a collaborative process that includes parent input, right? So one, it's really important for parents to be able to provide their input. Two, it's also really important and legally required that the school district doesn't predetermine the outcome. Now, there are times, when a parent may go into a meeting and they're not feeling heard. And it may feel like the district has come to the table with a decision already made, and are unwavering in that decision, regardless of parent input. That breaks the law, right? But sometimes it does happen, right? So what would you recommend for parents if they're going into a meeting with the best of intentions, of course, and they feel like, wait a minute, this is feeling really predetermined here?
Mhm. Yeah, I think that harkens back to the first part of our conversation with remembering that all things are not going to be decided within that first 60-minute meeting. So, if you are hearing discussion points that feel pretty canned, you feel again like the information that you're bringing to the table as the parent or the outside psychologist or the therapist is being completely swept under the rug or dismissed, knowing that you will have the opportunity to come back to the table and request subsequent meetings. If that is the case in the interim, I do recommend reaching out to more formalized supports like an advocate or an attorney that can talk through what your options are. It's also a good idea to record IEP meetings. So if you are in a situation where you feel like that has been the tenor of previous meetings, you can request to record the meeting in advance, and then you'll have that recording kind of tucked away if you do want to review it later with an advocate or an attorney. What about you, James? What other advice would you have to parents in these situations?
Yeah, that's I think that's excellent advice. I mean, everything you've shared here today is really excellent. Yeah, certainly not consenting to anything like we talked about earlier, and taking the time to review it. I do like the suggestion around recording. Now, school districts will say they need 24-hour notice of recording, right? So now most districts, I mean, if you get to the meeting and you're like, I want this recorded, most districts are going to say, okay, we're going to kind of waive the 24-hour requirement. But some districts may be sticklers about it, right? So you want to make sure that you're giving them 24-hour notice of recording. It also uh, it's not perfect in doing this, but I think it does kind of put people a little bit closer to their best behavior, when they know that they're being recorded. Um, it provides, you have documentation when you go back later, to say like, hey, like here's certain things that they said that maybe weren't consistent with what, the regulations say. Another way to sort of document some of those concerns too is just in the IEP meeting notes. So the school district's supposed to be taking notes of the conversation during the meeting. Now some districts, they're very bare bones, and in fact, they go into the meeting and there's already a pre-written template that they, may fill in some additional information to, right? Who was there, topics discussed, and so forth. But the IEP meeting notes are an official part of the IEP, right? So if there's anything that you want documented in the IEP paperwork, state it during the meeting. You can state that I want that included in the IEP meeting notes, and make sure that they read those IEP meeting notes back to you before the end of the meeting. So that's another way to document it. Um, if it's decisions around eligibility, for example, that you feel are sort of, predetermined, or, we talked about like the work samples and the writing test that was given. So maybe the test is called the Woodcock-Johnson test of achievement, and it has absolutely terrible measures of reading comprehension and written expression. And to be honest with you, I think anybody working in schools, if they're at all honest, will acknowledge the fact that that is not a very good measure of those two skills. But it's very, very commonly given, right? So if they gave this test called the WJ4, the Woodcock-Johnson Test of Achievement, fourth edition, right? And you're saying they have reading comprehension difficulties or writing difficulties, and they say those test scores are normal. Again, you can request a second opinion. We did our first podcast on the topic of independent educational evaluations, but if it feels predetermined, they're saying they're not eligible, that just doesn't make any sense with what your experience of your child has been, you can request a second opinion. Now, that doesn't guarantee the outcome of it. Maybe, the outside assessor says, hey, we did some really thorough testing in these areas, and, here's some areas that we identify, but maybe they don't require special education. I mean, that's certainly a possibility, right? But you do have that right to request a second opinion. So, again, consulting with an advocate or an attorney, requesting an independent educational evaluation, if the outcomes seem predetermined and you don't agree with the findings of the assessment. Certainly there's a number of things that you can do. But again, going back to that earlier conversation, you still have time, right? You don't have to consent to anything. You can request a follow-up meeting. I mean, there's lots of things you can do to sort of continue the conversation and kind of help the IEP team move more in the direction of some consensus around what your child's needs are.
Mhm. Absolutely, absolutely. I like that you brought up the IEP notes. So for parents, they are in the back. They're the last section of the IEP. So sometimes it can downplay their significance or importance. But as James said, sometimes districts are taking almost a transcript of the conversation, and sometimes things are not captured accurately. And so making sure that you read those, and if you do see anything that you object to, meaning maybe it was captured that parent agreed with psychologist report and you actually didn't agree in the meeting, you said I agree with this part, but I have questions about, again, maybe the reading comprehension, because I see a lot of reading comprehension concerns at home. Make sure that you're reading those notes, because you can request that they be amended to include what you meant to convey or perhaps what wasn't captured in writing.
Yeah, and you can even you can add to the document too, right? Like you can have your own parent concerns document that you say, I want this attached to the IEP. You know,
Mhm.
so that I mean, there's a section on the IEP where they're supposed to capture your concerns, but maybe your concerns aren't clearly captured there, or they go beyond the space that they use to fill that section in. But you can create your own document. I mean, you could even say, I want you to make copies of these work samples I brought, and I want you to include it in the IEP paperwork along with my concerns about, you know, whatever it is, right? I mean, so you as a parent, you still have you have a lot of say in that meeting, and I guess you know, you want to just make sure that if there are points of disagreement, you know, we're talking about like sort of predetermination, right? But if there's some things that you disagree with, you can absolutely make sure that those are captured and included in the IEP paperwork.
Mhm. Mhm. That's a great point.
Yeah. Anything else you'd add to this topic, Danielle?
I think the last thing I would elevate is just how normal it is to feel anxiety
Yeah.
or, a sense of helplessness, and pretty burned out as a parent in these meetings.
Yeah.
It's normal that they're overwhelming. I think that one of the things that's difficult is particularly special education happens behind closed doors, right? So everything is confidential. There are typically small group or one-on-one discussions, and it can feel really isolating. So just knowing that these meetings are emotionally difficult
Hmm.
for many of the people that are involved, whether that be parents or psychologists, and that there are steps you can take to practically prepare to try to reduce that burden as much as possible. So hopefully today's discussion was helpful in outlining some broad strokes of strategies.
Yeah, thanks for capping it off with that, because I think it's important to acknowledge, and you know, I wish honestly I wish sometimes schools would sort of take a step back and remind themselves of how challenging this is for parents too. But yeah, thank you, and thank you for all the information, Daniel. This was I can tell just how informative all of this was, just even listening to all of your suggestions today. This was really great.
Great talking with you this afternoon, James.
All right, all right, thanks.